welcome to the Teacher's Toolkit for Literacy, the free podcast for motivated teachers and school leaders who want to inspire their students and school community in literacy learning. Make sure you subscribe to the show on your favourite podcast player, and for more amazing literacy resources, check out the show notes provided with every episode.
Hi, I'm Sharon and I'm the host of a Teacher's Toolkit for Literacy. In every Toolkit episode, we bring you specific resources, tools, strategies, tips, techniques to help you in your job as a teacher of literacy. Firstly, we acknowledge and pay our respects to the Kaurna people, the traditional custodians whose ancestral lands we gather on. We acknowledge the deep feelings of attachment and relationship of the Kaurna people to country, and we respect and value their past, present and ongoing connection to the land and cultural beliefs. And welcome, Phil.
Thanks, Sharon. Great to be here. And welcome back to our podcast. It's part 2 of engaging readers and writers through book club with Dr. Jan Turbill. Enjoy. It's such an engaging way of actually teaching things that need to be taught in writing. You could teach it in a lecture style where you teach these things and then they all have to practice those things. But this is what Frank Smith was talking about. That doesn't really work.
No.
You need to get help from the authors to do this.
And probably it was the way certainly probably the way I was taught. And I thought I was a terrible writer. I didn't think I could write at all, not at all. And not until my Latin teacher, we had to write things in Latin about Cicero and goodness knows what else. Not in Latin, but in English. And she gave us essays to read. And I remember me thinking, oh, okay, this is how I should write this essay on what Homer's adventures were or whatever. And so I guess I recall copying that. And then I would get really good marks for these. And I thought, oh, okay, I can write. And then I guess I never felt, even when I was teaching writing as a teacher, that I was a very good writer. It wasn't until Bob Walsh in Peter's days said, you can write these. I want you to write up what's happening in the school projects you're doing. And it was like, oh, God, Bob, I can't do that. Yes, you can, he said. And with his faith in me, I did.
Yeah.
So one of the things that is in the chapter that Sue and Brett and I wrote is a very clear outline of the timing that we had, and we stuck to that timing. And so we started definitely with a whole group, usually about my whole group. Sometimes I would start with all 60, and I'd say, okay, we're going to start a focus on developing character. In the books you're reading, the author introduces your characters, but they don't do it all on the first page. So we're going to be looking at how your author develops character over your books. Which are the main characters, which aren't, which become sort of secondary and so on, and how many characters. Then that beginning focus over a term might be settings and plots and building tension or so on. So there were those 3 or 4 major items. So that was in the first 10 to 15 minutes. Then we always had some little activity where they broke off into their teams, and we gave the team leaders a question. And these questions had to be very clearly focused on what it was they were reading, not themes, not on the theme. That's what you do with traditional book club. We weren't looking at the theme of the books. They're often discussed, but that wasn't what our focus was. But how did the writer build tension on this page? Sometimes it was useful to photocopy a page out of that particular chapter. And then when they'd finished those discussions, we just asked for thought. That's all. So what did you think about this? What did you think about that? Or how did you answer that question? And the team leader could give a response, or somebody else. So that was no more than 15 minutes. And then we used to have power writing. And 20 minutes was set for that because they had to have their time for writing when they're absolute silence. It was just beautiful.
Yeah.
But in order to get them to write, they didn't just go blank. I didn't say go.
Right.
We all gave them either something out of the text they were reading, like it might have been something like the end of one chapter or the beginning of the next chapter, and then they had to go. So it might have been something like, I suddenly looked round, ... And then I'd say, okay, your story starter today is this. Or sometimes it'd be a choice. It'd be 2 or 3 like that. And I'd say, think about it for 30 seconds. And then I'd set my timer on my watch. I've got one of those watches. And then I'd say, okay, pen ready, go. And suddenly silence, absolutely almost like pressure on top of us. It went from noise to absolutely nothing as I wrote. And then it got up to 5 minutes. And by the time the 5 minutes was finished or getting close, I'd give them, look at the 30 seconds. And I'd say, got 30 seconds to finish. Get ready now to put your pencil down. And that was it. And then they'd start sharing around their group. Every child in the group had to read with each other, to share with each other, and then decide which of the ones that day would share with the whole group. And we made it clear that over a period of time, everybody would get a chance to share with the whole group, as shy as they might be. Sometimes there were 1 or 2 children in my group sometimes that wouldn't like to share with everybody, but would let me read it aloud, or another member of the group. And that was their choice. It was always their choice. Then I'd remind them of how many chapters they had to have read for the next week, and off they'd go. And Sue came up with a wonderful idea that she would develop bookmarks for every group. So I had to tell her how many chapters were needed to be read in each week across the school term, and that bookmark would have that on there for them so they knew exactly. The other issue about the books was that because they were school books, they couldn't be taken home. Now, that sounds terrible, but we wouldn't let the kids take the books home because being a Monday morning first thing, often it wouldn't come back. And they needed the book. So it was a critical part of the book club, of the story club time. They needed it. So they were given time during the school week to actually read, and they could choose any time, of course. And my avid readers often read right through the whole book. But they had to come back and reread those chapters for that day that we were going to be doing, week 4, we were doing chapters 4 through 7 or whatever. So that all had to be organised as well. But all that happened over the period of 10 or 12 years we did this. It was not something we all did on the first day or first week.
No. When they're doing the power writing, they're concentrating on a particular literary device or technique, or...
Sometimes we would suggest when you're writing today, think about where you might use rhetorical questions like Jackie's done in that chapter we've just talked about. Or it might be, how do you think you could put humour into this? And then, of course, you had to choose, I guess, story starters that had that sort of bit of sense of humour in it if you could or try to. But they used to catch that off each other too, which was interesting. And the boys particularly used to love to get a laugh. So they used to often put something in, and next week it'd be somebody else would have a go at doing it. But we did do that, particularly as we, I guess, learned from each other. And as I said, these days when we had not necessarily Christmas holidays, but in school holidays, we always met and talk about what we would be doing next session and or next term, and how things were going and how we might change things. I guess you could also say we were looking at a research, but it was action research, really, very much in place.
Over a long period of time too,
Over a long period of time, constant action research, yes.
And you were getting better and better at your way of doing it over all those years.
Yes. And I remember Brett saying one day, at first down I had no idea what questions to ask the children. Now he said it's like second nature.
Right, yep.
And I understand that because it's not usually the questions we ask of children, things like, what do you think is the main idea of this story?
Yes, that's right.
Well, that's not what we were asking. We were asking, what do you think the author's trying to say, or how do you think the author's saying it? What language is the author using to say it?
Yeah, because you're treating the author as a real person.
Yes, absolutely.
That's going back to that idea.
And
that
we had a wonderful other experience where we Sandy Fussell is a local writer here. And so Samurai Kid she was producing. And she came along and talked to the kids. And then another time I sent writing off to Libby Gleason. And Libby responded to them. And actually through Skype it was in that time. And we only had my computer. And she was talking to my group of kids, telling them, you know, I read blah, blah, blah. And you could have done this in this piece, she said. And you could have done this in this piece. And she was giving them advice, which was amazing.
Right.
Yeah.
So you would have seen some very strong writers being created in the classrooms, really?
We did. And one year, basically, we focused on boys as writers because Ralph Fletcher came out to one of the ALU conferences. He'd just written a book about boys as writers or boy writers. And in my group particularly, but not just my group, we found that the boys loved power writing, probably more so than the girls. No, shouldn't say that. But the boys loved power writing. There were very few boys who didn't like it or didn't enjoy doing it and didn't feel that they gained something from it. This came out of our surveys. And one year we decided to focus on them. And again, with parent permission through the principal, I chose 5 boys, or between myself and Sue and Brett, we chose 5 boys. We told them they were going to be my little co-researchers. And I met with them several times, not during book club time, but on other days. And we talked about how they were feeling about it, how we could improve what we did, etc. And then at one of the ALIA conferences, I got them reading their writing and talking to it and shared that with the audience. And again, with parents' permission, of course. And I found over a period of time as well that images were great to share. And because I was travelling a bit at the time, I used a lot of my travel images because you don't have to have permission to use your own photos. And they were great for identifying settings or characters and so on, and tension. So I use those for writing. I do have some pieces of writing I could share with you, but you want to do that?
Yep, sure.
Well, this particular day, we'd been talking about developing characters, and I'd used images which were free type images online. One was a pig demanding something, character. They were all animated, a horse. I think there were 4 images. And one was a donkey, a sad-looking donkey. And so this is one piece that Saxon wrote. Saxon was a very... he wrote lots of depressing pieces, actually, but very, very good pieces of writing. So this is a sad little old donkey. The old depressed donkey stomped through the overgrown paddock. Heading towards the town, the donkey stumbled over every pothole. Legs weak, the old donkey lay down and rested his head on the soft grass. Knowing his life had come to an end, the donkey made one last effort to raise his head and thank the earth for his life. The donkey's head fell to the ground with a thud. Vibrating the ground around him, bright lights filled the donkey's eyes. Then nothing. No pain, no ghostly feeling, nothing. The old donkey gone. The old donkey no longer had a presence on earth. His soul floated away from his body. The donkey was now looking down on his old, cold, lifeless body. A tear rolled down the donkey's soul and fell to the earth. Gone. Nothing. Cold. Dead. Now that's from an 11-year-old boy.
I've got goosebumps. That's just amazing. Oh my goodness.
And he wrote that just in 5 minutes. Now I took it, I write it up, I fix the spelling, I fix the grammar, I fix the punctuation. But that's his writing. Yeah.
Incredible
writing. And the boss used to read it and say, oh my gosh, Jan.
Yeah.
And these are boys who were avid readers, as I said, but didn't think they could write.
No.
They really didn't.
No.
And I mean, this is another one, Dylan, same donkey. Poor Flynn. Flynn was always ignored and neglected. So he's developing the character. He's giving you the name straight away. Always ignored and neglected. The old fat donkey begged on the side of the highway, but no one ever noticed him. He was covered head to hoof in shaggy grey fur, with his nose and underside a lighter colour, and truth be told, he stunk like rotten eggs and chunky milk. Flies were always slipping around Flynn's drooping face, and biting his irritated ears. I felt sorry for him, but of course I never did anything for him. You never know, someone might be watching, and that would be terrible. So I just stared in revulsion at poor Flynn as yet again my car zoomed by. So the character development there.
Incredible.
This poor donkey.
Yeah.
As well as him as the writer or the person, the other character, is very clear. Again, same thing, 5 minutes.
So, Jan, with this work, a teacher today in their classroom, how could they bring their kids to love writing again? Sometimes teachers have that approach to formulaic writing where we, do the genre and the structure. But what are your tips for teachers to...
It's a good question, and I've thought about it a lot. Sue and Brett and I talked about it a lot because we didn't think it would come to an end quite so quickly. But we knew it would come to an end when we wouldn't be able to run it like we were with three of us. There would be a time when I was no longer going to be available necessarily. Brett was talking about retiring, etc. So we did talk about it. We gave a talk to the staff one day about it. But I think it's the sense of teachers understanding that any book they're going to read to the children, whole class, or if they can get the librarian involved and actually break the class so the librarian uses her time or his time in the class to actually take a group of children too. But however, whatever organisation they can do, it's the teacher reading anything that they want the children to read with that understanding of what is it that the children can learn from this text. Now, I understand, and I've read many books on mentor text.
Yes.
A lot of people have taken up that idea and they've written books on it and so on. But they're still saying, well, I couldn't find it anyway in what I read, that you've got to let the author speak, not the text speak. A text is a dead thing on words on a page. You've got to let the author come through. So it's trying to change the way you ask the questions.
Right.
So that as you're asking the questions, you're putting the kids into the author's head and saying, well, and actually naming and personalising the author. Now, that might be hard if it's Chaucer or somebody that's gone long ago, but, most of our authors today who are still writing anyway have a website, and many of them talk about what they write and how they write, or keep a blog. So
it's bringing that author alive rather than saying the word mentor text, isn't it? Like it's...
and
mentor author. It's about the person.
It's about the person. It's about the way that person's chosen words to bring in whatever, attention or...
They've got a particular way that is particular to them. That's what we're trying to get across, isn't it?
Yes. And then get them thinking about... using something like power writing is, I think, a must. And I know what happened since neither Sue, of course, having died sadly, and Brett having left. Some of the other teachers I worked with who came in on the side, if you like, they were either there because they were casual and they took either Brett or Sue's class for a time and they had to quickly learn how to do this, but they're there now as full-time teachers. Now, they're using some of these strategies within their daily teaching, and I saw several of them at Sue's funeral and asked how things were going, not necessarily about book club. And one young teacher who actually had come to the school as a young graduate teacher, straight from Wollongong, she said, I use lots of those strategies. She said, I learned, and she actually sat in on Sue. So Sue was her mentor teacher. And she's using a lot of those with her year 2s and 3s. She said, it makes such a difference, Jan. It makes it all really enjoyable.
Yes, right. So even within your own lesson, you can have a text, but you're focusing in on the author and what they're doing in their device, and then you're moving into the power writing that's going to allow them to use.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, and I mean, we did start moving into more experimental sort of areas where we spent time on poetry. We had 2 years where we did playwriting. That was interesting, I can tell you, because as a playwright, you're actually writing the play for a character to turn it into something.
Yeah.
And the kids found that really hard when they wrote the play, which they eventually wrote a play in their small groups. They wanted to be the characters that they wrote. And we had to say, no, you had to change that so that you're the writer, but somebody else will be the character.
Yeah.
And so I think we did this 3 times. The first time was an absolute disaster. The third time, I think we told them that they were going to be writing the play in their group for another group to actually act out. So they had to put in the appropriate language around how the setting was, all the off-stage, on-stage directions.
Yeah.
And that turned out in the end to be really successful as well.
There would have been some great plays that came out of that.
Oh, yeah, and we started with a mentor text, which was simply the 3 pigs.
Yep.
And they went from there. The other, of course, using multimodal and so on, we used The Lost Thing written by Sean Tan.
Oh, yes, yep.
Then it became a short video, which won an Academy Award, I believe. And then there's lots of those now on YouTube. And they've been written or produced particularly as small, short stories. So we use those, but of course we didn't get the children to produce them, but looking at various issues that the curriculum requires and multimodal text. So we did look at that, but no, the most successful was just reading like a writer, focused during the novel reading and so on. And I miss reading the books that we were going to, because I used to read 3 or 4 books before we'd choose them.
Yep.
And I miss doing that, I must admit.
Yeah. So, but we'd like to, as you say, dedicate this podcast to Sue in particular, because passed away recently, and all the memories you had with her. And
yes, she was an amazing teacher, and I mean, a lot of the ideas around creating the teams and the team leadership and so on, and building year 5, 6 kids, sort of, I guess that's an age when the hormones are jumping in both girls and boys, I discovered. I've never taught them. And but Sue had this way of working with kids. It was just incredible. And at her funeral, Brett had agreed to give a eulogy to Sue as a teacher.
Yep.
And it was brilliant. It was very moving. And yes, I really would like to dedicate it to Sue McCall.
Yeah. And I guess...
And I know Brett seconded that. I mean, I asked Brett, and he said, oh, most definitely. So...
And I guess these were very fortunate teachers because they were allowed to experiment with their pedagogical practices and develop themselves as professionals over those years.
They were. The principals trusted them, and I think that's a really critical part, that the principal trusts teachers as a professional to do things. And I guess all that was ever required from both principals we worked with was that we keep some records and demonstrate what was happening. So the writing that I've just shared with you, each week I would take at least 2 or 3 of those, as the other teachers did, and we would write them up, send them to the principal, and sometimes he would even put them in the school newsletter. But the children knew that that was going to be happening, and that, I think, was also important.
Because the school then valued everything you were doing.
Yeah, and that was, they would share it maybe at a school assembly, that sort of thing was happening, or even go and share them with other classes, and that happened too. As I said, one of the at the beginning of every year, the things that we said to the children were, we're not going to be doing this to expect you to become great writers, but we want you to understand what it means to read like a writer, so that when you go to high school and you're going to be asked to write a history essay, and you think, how am I going to do that? So if you can find other history essays or somebody else's history essay and read it, or even ask the teacher. Ask the teacher, how do you write a history essay? And
I think kids are flying blind if they don't have an author that they can connect with.
That's exactly right. And that's why they've got no confidence in themselves as writers. And one of the things Bob Willits would do towards the end of each year, but really, or even each term, without even announcement, he'd just walk into the classroom, and he always knew that by 10:30, he knew I was leaving about then, he would come in, and because that was the time we'd be sharing, and he'd just sit there quietly and listen. And then he'd say something to the children about, he'd ask them questions. Well, how are you feeling about this? Did you enjoy this book? Now, the thing is, many of the kids didn't enjoy the book. But they loved what they learned from the book.
Yep.
That was really the Goat That Sailed the World, which is Jackie French. One chapter is written by this young boy who travelled with Captain Cook, and the next chapter is written by the goat. Now, I'm not going to go into the detail, but you get the goat's perspective, and then you get this boy's perspective about Captain Cook's trip around and then into Botany Bay, etc. And the kids, they found that boring. And then after a while, they began to see how different perspectives meant that same thing, but different perspectives meant the use of different language.
Yeah.
And some language is much more persuasive than the other language, because the goat's perspective was, green grass, I'm going to be happy here. Or whereas the boy's perspective was different, that sort of thing.
Yep.
And that was interesting, the thing that came out of that. You never quite knew what was going to come out, I tell you.
No. But you said it earlier that the sharing was such an important aspect of...
Absolutely, yes. And sharing, and not only sharing, but listening to each other and respecting each other's writing.
Yes, yep.
Kids are very judgmental. We know that. Year 5, 6 kids particularly begin to become very judgmental. They know when somebody's good or not so good.
Yep.
But I remember Sue sharing a story with her struggling readers. One of the young girls there, in fact, Sophie, her name was, she's made me a cushion I have here. It was one of her hobbies, and I have a cushion she made. And she was a foster child, basically.
Yep.
So she's had a fairly difficult background. And she came to Sue and said, and I forget the book that we're reading, but she said, that's the first time I've ever read a book. And
wow.
she said to Sue, and it's not going to be the last time. I said, of course. She said, books are good, aren't they? Well, Sue just hugged her.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
She couldn't wait to get to the lunchroom to say, guess what I just heard from Sophie?
And I guess in all this, Jan, there's different ways of approaching it with, we don't have to have the kids in different abilities. We could have mixed, a teacher in their classroom has got all different abilities.
Yes.
And that could have the same way of teaching, but it doesn't have to be in the way you guys organise that.
Oh, yes. We had to have it very tightly organised and very tightly scripted, if you like, as time and what happened when. And the kids needed that.
Yes.
And they knew it would be time. I'd only have to say, power writing is going to start in 3 minutes. And they knew they had to stop their discussion groups. But in the classroom situation, yes, it could be or would be quite different.
Yeah.
And not that I've done it that way, but I go back to the good old mantra again of teachers can listen to this podcast and they can take from it and adopt it, adopt bits of it, adapt them.
Yep.
and create to make it fit with our own.
As any good teacher would do, you've got that those professional choices that you can do. But just amazing today, Jan, though, that how you have identified a better way of teaching writing through really getting connected with authors and what literary techniques and devices they're using. And we got off track a bit, I guess, didn't we, after the 80s?
We did.
And we need to get more of Frank Smith's reading like a writer approach going on in schools, I think.
We do. And I go back to my family. I mean, I don't have children of my own, but I'm obviously very close to my nephews. My middle nephew, who's an academic, I can remember him saying to me when he first was starting the need to write journal articles, and so on, as we all do in the universities, publish or perish. And he said, I hate doing this. I really hate it. I said to him, Christopher, you read these journals. He came down here for a weekend and he had a whole pile of journals. I said, you keep reading them, but you're never writing anything. Yeah. And I said, remember when you used to be at my house? And I took him back to when he was a 6 and 7-year-old. Yeah. I'd read you such and such, and then I'd say, now you pretended you're such and such and do this. Yeah. And he looked at me and he said, oh, he said, that's right. Yeah. And truly, that's all I had to say to him.
Wow.
And now, he's published enough and he's got enough grants or whatever you have to do to become an associate professor,
Yeah. So, and even at that age, he's discovering himself as a writer. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
We have to.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm as I said to you, I'm now at the beginning. I said I'm the treasurer, for goodness sake, for Lions in my little group here. Now I said this again yesterday at a meeting. I'm not a numbers person. I'm a language person.
Yeah.
I said, but if we want to put this project together, we have to do it this way. This is how I've learned how to do this. And somebody looked at me and said, talking about the numbers, I said, but the numbers just are not very transparent. Let's put some words in there to make it transparent. And once you do that, it's like, oh, okay, now we can see what we're going to do.
It's a real life example of what we've been talking about today. Yeah. All right. Thanks so much, Jan, for joining on the podcast and all the wisdom that you've gained from those years. And I think connecting the research with the practice was just such an exciting thing to do. And you had the privilege of doing that. I did. And you're connecting the university with the school. That's another thing you were doing. There's so many things going on that was such a rich time for you and for all of us, because now you've shared it with everyone. So hopefully.
Well, thank you, Phil.
Yeah.
I'm very sad that COVID hit, and I did go back for one term, but it was too hard wearing a mask.
Yeah, that's right. Thank you, and thank you to all our listeners today, and bye for now.
Thank you, Phil.
Okay, bye Jan.
Thanks for listening to the podcast. To make sure you don't miss any literacy learning tips and insights, please subscribe to our show on your favourite podcast player. At Q Learning, our literacy specialists draw on over 30 years of teaching and international consulting experience to deliver world-class learning solutions. We equip, empower and support teachers to become their authentic selves. To find out about upcoming webinars and about how Q can help you and your school, visit qlearning.com.au. And you can get even more amazing teaching resources right now at teachific.com.au. Stay tuned.